welcome into the weeds.
Yeah, this will be quite interesting.
I hope so, mate. A real pleasure to have you on. You are the crime editor at the Daily Telegraph. You've been nominated for Walkleys. You've been following crime in Sin City in Sydney for 45 years. An amazing story. No one knows more than you. And you started out in 1980, I think, with the Daily Mirror.
That's right.
As a copy boy.
Well, actually, it started on the Australian.
Did you?
Yeah,
Tell us about it. How did you end up there?
I had never really had any aspirations to be a journalist. I really had no real idea, but I worked in a shipping company for a little while just down here in Bridge Street after I left school, which just numbed my brain. And then there was an advertisement for copy boy at a newspaper. And I thought, gee, that sounds okay. And my dad said, shipping company, that's very stable, big international. That media, he's an old Italian, migrant, and he was petrified I was going to this dirty world of media. So I started as a copy boy, and it was a little wild and woolly back then in the 80s at News Limited.
What's a copy boy?
Oh, a copy boy is probably politically incorrect for a start.
Okay.
That was what you were just a gopher. You started there, and there was a desk of us of about 5, and these were the days when it was called hot metal. A newspaper was made there with hot metal, and you have to run pieces of paper up and down stairs and resub it, and people would yell out, copy, and you'd run over, get it, charge down and give it to the guys who'd chip away. And so, as I said, there were typewriters going everywhere, but a copy boy was really just a gopher, a shit kicker that if you'd played your cards right, eventually you might get a cadetship, and it was really, really competitive. And I eventually got a cadetship on the Australian. And I wasn't a very good fit for the Australian, and eventually ended up on the what's now an afternoon newspaper that's now gone out of business for a long time ago, called the Daily Mirror, which was the real. We had 4 editions a day, and it was different. We were selling 600,000-700,000 papers a day, just our paper.
People don't remember, like a lot of young people wouldn't, like they don't even read newspapers. The physical newspaper. But there used to be a newspaper come out like in the morning, in the afternoon, literally, like used to be an afternoon or evening newspaper.
Well, it was 4 editions a day.
4 editions, amazing, and it was all like you had to have the copy. It had to be like created,
and it was a totally different world, and you had to get. There was another getting. We used to file, as you'd say, like if you were out at a crime scene, you would file over a 2-way radio back to the office where there were secretaries basically, or copy takers we called them, nearly all female back then. And you would dictate your story over a 2-way radio. There's somebody there typing away and somebody racing, grabbing bits of the paper, charging it back. As I said, it was like Hollywood back 30s and 40s, and it was a very exciting time. As I said, I kind of call myself now from typewriter to TikTok. That's how much it's changed. It was very, very different.
It was all analog. It was all done like manually, and people had to take a photo and get it processed. And
had to get
the whole thing.
back,
it wasn't they just there was no email. Everything was physical and up close and really visceral and real.
Yeah, it was. And there's what I find now a little bit, which has changed a lot, and it's a thing that we used to call the death knock, which was terrible. Like somebody had lost somebody to a car accident, murder, whatever. And we would be knocking on the door at 5:30 in the morning to ask for a photo from somebody. And that is a terrifying experience. It's something that, you don't like doing, but you had to do it. That was, otherwise no one knew what was happening.
And like those skills, like you had to develop them early. You must have balls of steel and also a lot of chutzpah, like to get the courage up to get involved in this area. It must have been a process. So tell us about your apprenticeship. You're a cadet journalist and you're on the crime beat.
Well, I wasn't initially on the crime, but you just roamed around in cars with 2-way radios, police scanners, You had a driver, photographer normally
Were
asleep.
they legal, the police scanners?
Yeah, they were back then.
They were, and then they...
Don't even start me on encrypted. They've now encrypted them, which means we don't get to find out anything unless the police media put out a press release. Although now we have everybody sends you something. But otherwise, back then we had a radio room which had 12 or so police scanners listening all over Sydney, somebody in there 24/7 listening. And it was a real skill to be able to hear, there's been a shooting there or something there. So, and that's how we did it. And I started off just doing general rounds, which was you'd cover nearly anything. You'd go out in the car and you'd get called up on the two-way and then sent somewhere. And then after a while, one of the police roundsmen died. Another one left to go to the Sun. There was a bit of poaching going on back then. And my boss turned around to me, and this is not a great story, but he basically said, "Mate, you drink a fair bit, don't you?" That's right, everybody drank. It was a big drinking culture.
And journalism back then, it was a big drinking.
Massive.
It was
not
hard drinking, smoking, late nights. It was a real calling.
Well, my first job as a copy boy was to go over and get a case of beer at 6 o'clock for the night shift, and then again at 10 o'clock at night. That was so they could drink. Then you go to the pub. There was a cigarette machine in the office on the floor. So yeah,
people smoked inside.
Yeah. Well, yeah, the roof was yellow.
Yep.
Right, and there was the desks had all these cigarette burns on them. So when the boss turned around to him, I think it was a guy called Cole Allen, who you might know, gone on to bigger and better things. Some would say that. And he said, "Mate, we want you to do police rounds." It wasn't called crime reporting then. It was a little bit more lowbrow, and it was police rounds. And I said, "All right." He said, "Why don't you go out there? You got to try and make contacts and that." And he basically said, "You can claim up to about $100 a week drinking. And if you're not claiming that, you're not really doing your job." Now, that'd be a work and occupational safety issue. I've said this 100 times. I now spend more time drinking coffee with cops than I do drinking. And that's what we did. And as romantic as I make it sound, and as much as I enjoyed it, I lost a lot of friends very early to alcoholism, and marriages everywhere. And seeing, like, one of my heroes was a guy called Jack Darmody. I followed him around like a little puppy. He was this gruff guy, camel plane, early openers. You'd be in a pub at 6:30 in the morning if nothing was doing. And he died a pretty lonely sort of death. I had to bury him along with some of his good friends, because those that lived that lifestyle, it took its toll. I mean, I feel lucky that I've been able to transition to the modern world. As I said, it was hardly, and it sounded great, but it took its toll. But it's a very,
and it was a tough subject matter too, because you're talking about, you're getting a phone call and there's been a stabbing, there's been a murder. Tell us about the police rounds, because we're talking about Sydney in the 1980s, and it was called Sin City. It was like especially inner Sydney, King's Cross, it was a hotbed of corruption and mayhem and the like. There was probably a lot to do, and some of it would have been tough work.
It was, as I said, those death knocks, which I talk about,
and that's where you're asking the family if someone is for a photo of a child or a wife, or oh my God.
And some people call them intrusions, and how can you? But I always had to have in my mind, why was I knocking on that door? I had to have a reason, and you had to tell people. Well, if you just say, "Oh, 4 people were killed in a car accident," isn't that terrible? You start putting photos of human beings, and you're hoping that somebody, next time they get in their car, they're thinking a bit different. One really memorable one is, again, younger people would remember, we had our train system, things called red rattlers. That was the trains, and the doors you could open, right? And this young guy, I think he was about 17, had stuck his head out, and it didn't happen infrequently. Ka-chung, head taken off, died. I've been given the name and the address, which, the old police rounds, they had contacts to get you the names. And so I've gone, it was pouring rain. It was somewhere down in the Shire, I think. And you used to have this thing, if it's a flat and you have to push a buzzer, you've got less chance of getting in. Face to face you might. It sounds pretty callous, but I'm thinking, pouring rain. When we've got no hope here, that's okay. And you were relieved, hopefully, that they were going to tell you to piss off. I've buzzed, and his mother's obviously answered and said, and I said, look, I'm really sorry. It's Mark Morri from the Daily Mirror. She said, I've been waiting for you to come up. And she had a photo album there. And she said, this is a photo I want you to use, and I don't want to see anything but attacking the government for letting these doors be open. We've known this has been going on. So that makes you feel a bit better. But there are other times where you just feel like shit. You know, there are people there just howling. But
there's
you have
people
to
in
do
the, people in the middle of their grief.
Yeah,
and sometimes you might have been the first person that they've talked to since the cops called them.
Invariably. And so, but now, most of the young journalists don't do that. The photos of victims come from Facebook and, you know, even, you know, I don't know how long since I've knocked on somebody's door to do that. I've had a lot to do with victims and stuff, but you learn empathy and you learn a little bit more about when you're writing, you're thinking there's a reason why I'm doing this. And that's because there is this victim, there is this family. And to see the human face to face is as harrowing as it is. I think it teaches you to be a little bit a better journalist in some ways, a little bit more understanding. And as I said, as horrible as it is, it sometimes has to be done. Otherwise, we don't have a face to anything that's happened.
And like going to your question of, you know, why are you doing it? You know, it's about, in a lot of cases, it's making sure it doesn't happen again, or in some of these cases, it's about justice. Who has committed this crime? A lot of the times you're reporting on unsolved homicides, armed robberies.
Yeah, a lot of that. We did a lot of that. And there were always photos, you know, used to drink in the armed hold-up squad, used to drink in the homicide, like go back to that drinking culture and the relationship between police and journalists was a lot closer, but in some cases a little bit unhealthy. You know, I had no idea that a lot of the cops I was drinking with back then, especially around the cross, that they were as corrupt as all hell. I had no idea. I was this naive boy from Hornsby that thought, oh, you don't pay when you drink with policemen. Or that's just the way it is, you know. And I'd be there downstairs in the Bourbon and Beef with a guy called Chook Fowler, who started the
very famous Wood Royal Commission.
Chook was fantastic for me.
At the Bourbon and Beef stage.
Downstairs, right. And then a couple of others. Who
a very famous pub that's...
It was a bar, one of the only, you know, after 11 o'clock in Sydney, there was nowhere, like 10 o'clock, if you lived in the burbs, there was nowhere to go. Everyone headed to the cross. And I remember that, like, again, I was from Mount Colah, Hornsby, some suburbs. And I remember first, like, being there, and I would see my mother's tennis friends then, like, you know, who were playing up at 1 o'clock in the morning, like, because it was the only place to go after dark, so to speak, in Sydney. So I'd drink there with Chook, and again, that was, you know, that was learning to make contacts, and then and he helped me enormously.
It must. Like, you've raised a couple of really interesting things there, and the first one is like, how do you maintain that separation? It must have taken a toll on you. There must have been some, like, we call it PTSD now, but it must have been affecting, and you must have had to become incredibly resilient to it. You know, people cope in different ways.
Well, yeah,
like,
that was the booze.
That was the booze.
You know, and I think it happens particularly in the police force. It used to happen, journalism, and happen. You know, and I think modern society is a lot better now in coping with that. We're very careful with any of our young reporters who maybe have been to a traumatic scene. You know, straight away they're offered counselling. Years ago it was, oh, mate, let's go down the pub and get shit-faced. That was okay, but you woke up and you really hadn't addressed what had happened, so you'd go and do it again. You do, I think you get a little resilient, you get a little cynical. Some of the.
Do you ever get angry? Like, there must have been some fire in you, Mark, like going, like, and we'll get to some of the more famous cases you've covered. You must have thought, these bastards, you know, like, you must have felt, I'm like we got to catch these bastards. Was there part of that? Like, you're on the case as well?
I never kind of got that. I don't believe that I was a policeman, but I did believe I could help. Yeah, and you would go and you would feel the anger, and you know that case, obviously the most famous one for me, and the one I got so involved in was the Anita Cobby case. It still brings tears to my eyes at times. And I was only a young reporter. It was 1986 when that happened, and that story was it is the most horrible story that Sydney's seen. We've seen
One of the worst.
One of the worst. They're all worse
in the world.
And it was, unfortunately, and I hate to say this, and it's the media. Anita was beautiful. Anita was a nurse at Sydney Hospital just across the road.
She was
from
a
here.
beauty pageant winner
For charity.
and an incredibly beautiful human being.
And she meets pure evil. Like literally, she was walking home. And I did she was walking home after a shift and a dinner with some friends, warm night. All the public telephones, which you don't know, there's no mobiles. She couldn't ring her parents to get a lift. She thought it's not too bad. She's walking. She is just grabbed off the street, and the whole of Sydney went crazy. I'm telling you, it really did. I mean, I wasn't around for Vietnam protests, but I do remember when they finally caught these guys. Some of them were out at Blacktown Police Station, and there was a crowd of 400 or 500, or maybe more at Blacktown, and that was huge. And they were rocking this police car as they were bringing in. I think it was one of the Murphys, or it might have been John Travis, who was the ringleader. And I've spoken, and I'm still in touch with one of the cops involved in the case now, and still very close to John Cobby, Anita's husband. But they were rocking that. At one stage, they thought they were going to tip the car. That's how angry Sydney was. It did reverberate around.
I think there was even moves in the parliament to bring back in the death penalty.
It was very, very well.
There were people calling for the death penalty because it abolished the death penalty. I think in New South Wales it might have been the 60s.
60s, I think.
I think the 60s were the last. Early 60s had been the last execution, but there were people saying that these bastards need to hang. I
do remember there was one of the workmen had thrown a rope and made a noose over one of the buildings out there at Blacktown. And everybody was filming it, and it was a little lighter side. I'll never forget, it was hang the bastards, blah, blah. And then the guy called it up, and then one of the TV crews arrived late. Someone said, "Oh, you should have seen this." And they hunted down the guy to get him to go and do it again so they didn't miss it. But it was, as I said, Sydney was absolutely seething that this had happened. And as I said, the media went crazy. We did go crazy because we had that amazing photo of her walking through Martin Place just days beforehand with this huge smile. Then there's a photo of her with Neville Wran, the Premier, the nurse. So there was all these ingredients. A year or two later, Janine Balding is murdered.
Well, yeah, and the murders are the most egregious.
Yeah.
A rape and the violence of them. And it's something it was sort of unique to that period. There was this period in the 1980s where we had this sort of rash of these incredibly violent abductions, sexual assaults, and then violent, stabbing murders. Yeah. Why was it that happened at the time?
I still think we've got them going now.
They
really are. I think that one that was it was a pack, right? That was the pack. It was a pack thing. Again, she got so much more media attention than had she been nowhere near as attractive, which is especially back then, the media.
Or a sex worker or something like that.
And that is, I'm having a go at us now. We've grown up a lot.
Yeah.
We were still stuck in some very, very old ways, but that's what generated so much, and that had all those ingredients. I still think there are, Stephanie Scott, school teacher down at Leeton. That is just that is a horrendous story of a school teacher a week out from when she was going to be married. She's attacked at a school on Sunday, Easter Sunday. She's viciously stabbed and burnt. Her body's burnt. Photos of the guy took photos.
I was living in Western Sydney, Western New South Wales, and that happened, and just the most shocking.
And we get back and we'll get onto serial killers there, because the guy who killed a Taran, I can't remember his exact pronunciation, but his intended target was actually a neighbour's daughter that he was going to kill, who went away. So he just had to kill. Now, the cops got him, which is fantastic work, and this is what maybe moving on to now. They stopped a serial killer. That guy was going to keep going. There's also another brutal murder of Morgan Huxley, a young guy over there at Mossman. Again, that got enormous publicity because he was a good-looking guy from good family, all those types of things. Now, the young guy that killed him, a guy called Kelso, he was a serial killer in the making, and the cops got him after one. So, I think nowadays the police are so much better at their job that there is so much more technology that giving him those ability that they
And this was in the emergence where they were able to profile people. They began to say, this is the type of person or persons we're looking for. We're looking for someone out there with priors, all of these different criteria they met, and they can really pin it down and geographically and demographically.
There's
pretty
all sorts
quick.
of a lot more tools now, that they can use, all that experience and stuff. As I said, so back then in the 80s, it was more gut instinct. I think we'll get onto the fact there were a lot. There were serial killers. Everyone says, where are the serial killers gone? Well, they've been caught. That's where they are now.
They get caught at one or two.
Yeah, maybe. That's where it's at now. Whereas, and we'll get, the Ivan Milats, the granny killers, they wouldn't have survived. They would have been got by the modern policeman.
Just on the on the Murphys, like where did these people come from? I mean, they I've been looking into I've been looking into a lot into Ivan Milat and his back history. We know about the backpacker murders, but what he was doing for the 30 years before. There's no doubt. But where did some of these people come from? Like the Murphys in particular. I've heard stories about them being involved in the Cross and some of the crime there. Like
it was very hard to pin. I was actually given the task of trying, just you've got weeks. Go out there and just try and find out more about. And it was, going to early openers in Piermont with my legend Jack Darmody, because I was scared shitless because these were tough pubs. And someone said they keep pushing them across the bay from Piermont to Balmain to the western suburbs. Their origins are very murky, but they were involved in, the Cross. John Travis just came from western suburbs, and he was just an evil guy.
He was a bad motherfucker, wasn't he? Like he was like bestiality, killing animals, rapes,
and
he was just a time bomb.
He was, and after he had slit Anita's throat, he went back to the car apparently and said, "I did me first one." And then he did want to get, while he was on the run, he'd left his knife and he wanted the knife that he'd used because it was his favourite knife. As said, they were just evil, and he had raped men, women. And the other thing is, he wouldn't give a shit in jail. I think he'll be getting his sex there. He won't care. The only thing he'll miss out on is his drugs.
If that.
Yeah. Well, that's probably.
It's a strong argument for, stringing some of them up. But but wait, I'm not asking you to comment on that.
Oh, no, I grapple with that. Like many people.
Well, I know Tony Windsor, who's a darling of the left now, the progressive left and independent MP. He actually moved a bill in the 1990s. There was a terrible murder up in northwest New South Wales. The guy was stone cold guilty, admitted it, rape, murder, a terrible abduction of a young woman, and he moved a private member's bill to bring back in the death penalty just for that bloke. And but
the Cobby killers were never to be released. And that started a whole string of problems legally. But so you're thinking, well, they're never to be released. No, what are they doing? Sucking up taxpayers' money.
Mm. Well, they're rotting, and it must hurt. And I'm glad that
John Cobby and I still.
And this is the thing. Yeah. You were so heavily involved. You were you're in your early 20s.
Yeah.
You're out there. You're covering this most horrendous crime. The guys are rounded up pretty quick. It's going to
And they use tactics that wouldn't do now.
I know the movie just shows them getting bashed straight away.
John talks about, and I'm still good.
Because Anita's husband, well, they were she was married and they were estranged. John
just
Cobby,
recently.
just recently,
Like
that's right.
they literally were working to get it together.
That's right.
And John,
And he was just like heading up the coast,
yeah,
wondering where his wife was, still wife, and then he's on the radio. A woman's been found in the paddock. You've got to go and talk to this guy.
So, but
and you've maintained a relationship. You've written a book about Anita.
Well, he changed his name, and
that's right. He was hard to find, wasn't he?
He was, and we tracked it, and it was literally, and somebody knew somebody crooked in what we then called the Department of Motor Transport. Found out he'd had a dodgy license. Anyway, because the cops, he was just nowhere. No one knew could find him. Anyway, found John, and not a proud moment, but basically talked him into talking to me. It was almost black, but John and I. Then after that, I never revealed his name, even when we did do the big story after the court case. And I knew he moved around from hospital to hospital where he was working. And something would happen with one of the Murphys, or they'd be bashed, or one broke out of jail at one state, or and my boss would say, hunt down John, and I'd hunt down John and say, right, you're going to give me a comment? He'd go, oh, no. So I'd go back and say I couldn't find him, or he's moved, and so we built up trust, and we, funnily enough, he lived at Bronte and I lived at Bondi, and I hadn't seen him for about 5-10 years. We bumped into each other, and then we started becoming quite good mates. And then on just before the 30th anniversary, John said Anita's parents had been dead, and they had always taken the ball up very publicly. Gary Lynch, he almost ran for office, and it scared the shit out of Bob Carr, I'm telling you, because if he'd run as an independent, he probably would have won and held the balance of power at one stage. And John said, they're gone. Somebody had organised some sort of anniversary, and who had nothing to do with Anita, and it made him angry. And I'd been at him to write a book about it, so he said, fuck it, let's write it. So we did, and I'd never written a book. I mean, I'm a late starter. I was like in the early 50s, and we did the book, and it was really good in a way, because halfway through, I tear up a bit. John said, guess what? I said, what? He said, Dan and I, that was his son. I went down to the registry and changed my name back to Cobby, because after the murder, that name he was too scared to have. But halfway through the book, 30 odd years later, he took his name back, and that was a pretty good moment for him. Now, if I ring John, he said, "Tell me one more's dead." That's the first thing he said. I go, no, the Roosters got shut on again. Then we talk about footy or cricket. So we still have a relationship like that. And as I said, out of a horrible thing, I made a good friend because...
And a great book.
And a lot better than the one after it. The other one after it was shit house. It was really terrible. But,
30 years. And so you had to build up that relationship. You build up that trust.
Yeah.
And that's been a key part of your story. And it's I don't want you to give away the secret sauce here, but you've had to maintain relationships and trust with senior police, detectives working on these crimes who might give you information that they might not, that they probably shouldn't be, or like giving you a drop on something, giving you the inside. But also you've got to do that with criminals.
Yeah.
And so you have to know who the criminals are, where they are, what they're up to, and
be very careful with them. And I tell all the young people, and
where's the line? Like,
I don't socialise.
Because they would be wanting to draw you across, compromise you, that sort of thing. I mean, what if they tell you something that's like illegal, like potentially illegal? How you handle that?
You've got to be very careful. I keep my distance with some of them. And it's to be quite blatant. Nowadays, the modern day crook you're going to meet either in a mosque or a gym, the Middle Eastern guys, I just don't have any affinity with. I used to drink with other guys who were very dodgy. Maybe one or two might have been killers. There were things you just didn't want to hear, and you made sure you didn't hear them. I've been very careful. I don't think I've ever really been heavily compromised. I really haven't. and the cops know it. They probably know half the people I talk to sometimes because I do remember, I have popped up. Cops said, "Oh, you didn't know about that, but you have popped up on a couple of phone taps, And that would happen to not just me. I'm not saying that it would happen to quite a few journalists in this area, probably politicians and ICAC as well.
New South Wales Crime Commission, hello.
Yeah,
ICAC.
Mr. Barnes, how are you doing? So there's the difference. I always say crime reporting is the hardest, but also probably the most honest in some ways. As I said, no offence, but politicians, I do remember having something to do with I won't say who, one of the officers, and they screwed me over. And I said, I deal with crooks with more honour than you. And I really do. I mean, when they lie, they're lying.
And there's not a lot of opinion really in what you're doing.
Well, see, there's
you're really dealing in a lot of facts.
Most of the time, there are, unless you get into the politics about
of why something's being looked into or not.
But it's very, very hard, especially now. It's even harder because everyone's so scared. So police are normally secretive about their investigations half the time.
What do you mean everyone's so scared? The criminals are so scared?
The cops are more scared of their phones being off than the crooks nowadays.
Oh.
Because there's this control factor that has been going for the last 20-odd years. Me drinking, I used to go drinking every Thursday with Homicide, armed hold up Wednesday, that motoring squad. And
Special Branch? What was it?
Special Branch. Yeah, that was I didn't have many in Special Branch. I was a bit too young for that.
But so let's talk about that. How has the nature of crime and policing changed in your time? Like, let's talk about crime first. Like, 1980s Sydney was probably one of the most corrupt places on earth. It was like, I say this, like, Sydney was a backwater. It was a geographic backwater. It was a big city, but a lot of people came here to get up to no good. There was an emerging drug market.
Yeah.
There was a lot of money to be made and some very, very corrupt police that weren't necessarily doing their job. Tell us about the culture back then. Now, this is the era, Roger Rogerson, who knew.
Yeah.
So tell us about Roger the Dodger and I mean, this could go for 3 weeks.
That's right.
But the culture.
The culture was, I didn't even, you got to remember I was a boy from Hornsby again. I keep saying that. Quite naive. And so my father didn't gamble. Like, he was just a hard working, the Italian that, I called him Wog Done Good, which you're allowed to say back then. Now I get in trouble, but I'm a
I know you're allowed to say it again, especially if you are a wog. You're allowed to.
Well,
Wogs can.
Yeah. And so I came and started drinking with these cops and didn't know that they were corrupt. And then I got put into my head.
And they were charming bastards.
And
they also did do some good things. They did catch some bad buggers.
Controlled corruption was the line that I was, and I saw and actually, I saw an example of it where I actually thought it was justified. I no longer believe that, I'm telling you now, but I was naive and stuff. So there was I'd been on Midnight to Dawn, which you'd be in a car just going around, and there'd been 3 stabbings up at the Cross, like a couple of minutes, and we'd hear it and we'd get there, stab. Anyway, at about 5:30, there's one in Allwall Lane, I remember, and it was fatal. What had happened is there was a junkie who normally heroin addicts are more sedate, they get their shot. But this guy was desperate for money and he was just going head down, give me your money, and then stab him, all right? And then, anyway, so they stabbed, the last guy died. And I do remember the cops back then, they just went to the shooting galleries where everyone could score their smack, and they just went, you guys give them up or else we're going to keep fucking you over. But they knew them all. They knew where they were because they were getting money from half of them,
yeah.
And they got that guy. That was controlled corruption at work. Then again, there wouldn't have been half those shooting galleries if the cops weren't taken. It wouldn't have been the heroin. I didn't see that side of it. So that controlled corruption in the 80s, it was just rife. It was rife. But some of those guys believed that they could keep a lid on it by taking some money, as long as the general public weren't hurt.
As long as it was criminals killing criminals, and who cared if a few people on the periphery got knocked off?
Which they didn't back then. They seemed a lot better at doing it, right?
Yeah.
We've now got the modern there. When you say changed, it was a shot to the back of the head at midnight, or guy last seen drinking at a certain inner city hotel, and his bones were found 15 years later at Foreshore Drive. They weren't going into gyms and shopping centres and opening fire
and shooting up preschools and all this mayhem with the woman.
Well, I was going to say that is still here. We have this kidnapping of a woman burnt and a 8-year-old hit with a baseball bat and put into a coma. Now that's just that's up there with one of the most brutal, just ruthless, and just horrible crimes. That's just next level. I think with the children, as we and I don't buy this. We had the 2 women that were shot out at Greenacre. One of them was well connected in the Underworld, Faldella. Another one was a young hairdresser by Amy, and everybody said, "Oh, they've crossed the line. These guys never before. They don't kill women." Bullshit. They were killing women back in the 80s, but they were doing them with hot shots. Lynn Woodward, who was Sally Ann Huckstep,
found murdered in Centennial Park.
Romantic again. I'm going there. I'm thinking this was all control. They were killing people.
Yeah,
and it wasn't just murderers, and that it was people that dared to stand up to them. So that took a lot of romance out of it when my eyes were open. And even though I became friends with Rogerson, friends is a elevated word. I was conned by him. I didn't know him back then when he was out of the force when I really started to get into crime, but he still controlled Sydney. And it was later after he came out of jail. But I was also, and still am, very good friends with Mick Drury, who was the undercover cop that Rogerson allegedly, we don't have to say allegedly.
Shot him through the kitchen window.
Fucker's dead.
Yeah. Shot through the
kitchen window.
That was, what was that, Dale Flannery?
Christopher Dale Flannery.
Yeah.
So, and that was something I had, and I'll give Mick Drury his due. I was, conversing quite a bit with Rogerson back in the last 10, 15 years, not way back then. And Mick Drury said, "I know you've got to do what you've got to do." Roger still knew a lot of what was going on in town. A lot of people thought he was an old man and everything. And I just thought he was a dirty Harry. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
He was killing the
bent the rules, with a good intent, but wasn't just doing it for the coin.
And then then after he killed Jamie Gow, and I have no doubt it was him, Glenn McNamara, that my editor at the time, Christopher, said, "I want a few months, dig into Roger. You knew him." And I came away just feeling like an absolute buckwheat. He was this guy that I thought was dirty. And then the more I spent months talking to so many people, and because he had been locked up, a lot of people spoke to me a lot more openly. And I realised he was just a stone-dead killer. He was just an evil, evil man. And we wrote.
Yeah, you executed Warren Lanfranchi in the street.
Yeah, and
Chippendale.
And all those. But it was more the Lynn Woodward and the Sally Ann Hucksteps. Even if he didn't kill Sally Ann, he certainly was heavily involved. And the Lynn Woodward was hardly anyone knows of. She just vanished because she was in a coroner's court. She was flatmate of Lanfranchi's mate. She was the girlfriend with an armed robber. And she was going to talk about the corruption. She stood up and said, "I'm going to tell you about police corruption. This is the inquest into Lanfranchi." And they said, "Okay, we'll adjourn this and we'll come back at a later date." She walked out the back of the coroner's court, never to be seen again. Roger and Nettie Smith grabbed her, and that's it. So, anyway.
And the motivator, of course, for these guys was power. They just thought this was their town. They ran it. They literally green lit armed robberies.
Yeah.
The lot of the heroin at the time, and cannabis at the time, which was but mainly heroin.
It was
illegal-
heroin that went
went-
crazy.
went crazy. It was big money in
the
it.
90s, and we haven't even touched the Vietnamese crime gangs. I mean, let's face I ended up going to New York and working for the New York Post.
New Post for a while.
Yeah, and it was quite.
How did we rate with New York?
Well, that's what he said. It was really funny. I went over there, and I was just a shit kicker, like just walking. They sent me places that the dumb Aussie went in. I had no idea. I'd come back and go, what the? The cabs wouldn't. I did go to the Bronx, second day, cop shot Bronx. I went there, the cabbie said, I'm not going there. I went, well, and I kept just wandering around like a hapless water buffalo. Anyway. And
I once caught a cab in Dallas, and I said I want to go to this place, and the guy started driving me there to South Dallas. I don't even have been there, and it is bad. And we got halfway there, and he said, he goes, look out. He goes, look out the window. He said, you see how all the street lights have gone? He said, they shoot out the street lights, and he said, this is as far as I go. And he said, I can either take you back, or you can get out here, but know this: the police won't come. The police won't come in.
No-go zone.
This is a no-go zone. This was an area where they just said, we don't come in here after dark, and we don't come in here without en masse. Well, so, there you are in the Bronx.
And that was, that was quite an experience. And I do remember, like, then I was, having a few beers. I was drinking with a guy, legendary Steve Dunleavy, an Australian reporter. But there was some other little smart-ass guys from the Daily News, which was the opposition. And this guy goes, oh, man, it must be pretty exciting having crime here in New York City. And I go, oh, it's pretty shitty. It's pretty fucking lowbrow. And he goes, what do you mean? And by this stage, I maybe had tried my first few hundred martinis. And I said, well, my first big story was 7 shot dead in a bikie massacre. Where are you? It's at a car park.
Milpera massacre.
That was one of the first big stories.
Father's Day massacre.
Father's Day. I said, oh, yeah, undercover cop shot. He went, oh, yeah, and, by another cop. I said, then we had an MP taken out, John Newman. That's what I was getting to. We are up there.
Yeah.
To take out, the Vietnamese crime gang took out an MP.
Phung No, wasn't it?
Phung No is still in jail
Still in jail.
And then I said, oh, yeah.
Just shot a political rival, cleaning up Cabramatta.
And,
shot out the front of his house. Stone cold.
Yeah, that was that. And then I did, the Port Arthur massacre. I said, 36 dead. He said, oh, yeah, you do have some crime down there, don't you? So we do. When you think about, thank God
Ivan Milat.
Ivan Milat, a serial killer of how many? We don't know. We really don't.
Well, just
that's what I thought you might.
Let's talk about Milat because, I'm just surprised. My interest is piqued because I've been looking at how many murdered and missing women there were on the north coast of New South Wales, and it's running into the hundreds of unsolved homicides and disappearances in that period, the 70s, 80s into the sort of the 90s period, where you could sort of say that there was a lot more of this sort of activity. And in looking into it, what we've seen is 2 things emerge which is one's well known, is that Ivan Milat didn't just kill 7 kids in the forest down at Belanglo. What else did he do? And then the other one is, did he operate alone? So where else was he operating? Did he operate alone? The story we're told about Ivan Milat is, didn't play well with others, pretty sadistic, gun nut, kept to himself, hung around his family.
And a very big, wild family.
Big, wild family. There's no doubt about it. But not a very social character, and sort of operating on the highways and, working on the roads down in southwest Sydney, that Liverpool area. But the more I'm looking into it, the question is, did he travel a lot? Did he have other friends? And was he more embedded in the Sydney crime scene than people really understand? And that's a question I have.
Well,
did his name ever come up in terms of organised crime?
Never, ever at all. There's have you read My Brother's Keeper?
Yes.
Les. One of the Les Kennedy.
Les Kennedy and
and Mark Whittaker. And Les knew more about the Milat family than Clive Small, who led that task force, the detective. And that book, it sets out, it's quite methodical and brilliantly researched. Ivan undoubtedly did some murders on the north coast. Everybody, I think, concedes that. Working alone? No, there was definitely somebody especially some of those in Belangolo. I think that's accepted by a lot of people, except for maybe Clive Small, who led that task force, and he has stuck to that, which you would think the guy that arrested Ivan Milat, who led that task force, he would believe that. But there are many others who were there who were, that task force had its issues, who believed that maybe they'd gone too early, and if they had maybe waited, because they had Ivan under surveillance, that they may have got somebody else. But what I think with those murders on the North Coast, particularly in disappearances, that there would have been a number. There was another guy called Ashley Coulston, who at the time the backpacker murders were happening, we were digging around, and this guy, who's now currently in Victorian prison for triple murder, but he was going up and down New South Wales coast as well. I think is a main suspect in disappearance of 2 girls down from Cronulla, and Milat's one, but this guy, Coulston, is red hot. We know there's a guy currently incarcerated on some charges who I think police are very convinced that he's involved in probably 4 or 5 murders up around the Newcastle Hunter area.
Yeah, I'm aware of that one.
And you're aware of him?
The fella from Queensland.
Yeah, we won't say his name.
No.
There's also some I've heard of that there were some brothers. This is something I've only recently found out. I've got to dig into. That this person no longer in police force or law enforcement. He believes that there are some brothers from north of Sydney who may have been involved in a number of, like, 6 or 7 murders, which I've got to dig around in. So when you and unfortunately, a lot of disappearances too are just tragic disappearances.
They're suicides, misadventure.
And there's a lot also of those where police know who they call it. It's resolved but not solved. You know, they can't get it to
they don't have the evidence.
They don't have
the time.
And they work really hard. There's this unsolved squad. They're getting about 2 or 3 a year, which is, and these are 20.
We looked at Chris Dawson, like that one there.
Yeah.
After the fact, and there's, there were these gay hate crimes that they're looking back at.
And there is no doubt that there was evidence missed. There was sloppy police work. Or
do you think there was like the thing that intrigues me, and I've read everything on Milat that you can find, there is this sort of this area where he sort of disappears into the mists of time from the early 70s and until the
90s.
Yeah, until the 90s.
And that just doesn't make sense.
And it doesn't make sense. And I've asked the state government to release his work records because he worked for the DMR. But what we've learned is too that he spent a lot of time in the Cross.
That's right. See, I'd never heard that, and I'll be,
He worked on the King's Cross Tunnel. So he was a jackhammerer working on the King's Cross Tunnel in 1975, 1976. That's where he got big, really. Wow. He was big in jail.
Yeah.
And but he worked there, and he also worked digging sewer mains in the cities. And I've asked the government and the cops for his police files, also his prison files, and also his work records. The government's saying yes, but they're not in a big hurry. They've released to me information about, yes, he worked for the DMR for this period of time. They haven't told me yet, and I'm going to pursue them, where he was working. And one of the things we do know, though, he was working in the Cross.
Wow, I'd never.
Yeah, for many years. He was in and out of jail. He was on the run in the early 70s, and he did work in the Cross from that early 70s to about 1976. He spent a bit of time on remand and then got off a double-armed robbery and which is
he was acquitted on the kidnapping and rapes, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was acquitted on the kidnapping and rapes, but 4 days before he was acquitted on an armed robbery that the 3 other people, including his brother, went to jail for more than 10 years for, which he admitted to, and he went on the run for. Faked his own suicide and then disappears, ends up working for the DMR and then comes back, gets off. So, I think that there's a lot to learn about, and with modern techniques, about what happened to Ivan. And have I shown you the photos of the identikit?
I saw that in the paper recently.
Yeah.
I didn't. I was on holidays, but I didn't really dig Into it.
I think that's a pretty interesting one. The identikit of the Wanda Beach killer and Ivan Nat in Milat in 1964.
Yeah.
It's stone cold if they're not the same person.
Well, I still think Christopher Wilder.
I know Wilder was.
I think he's red hot for that one, but.
Well, one of the things is with the Wanda Beach, it was. I know this is terrible to say out loud. It was a murder then a rape, and the same with Belangolo. And a lot of times it's the other way around. Yeah. And so, stabbing like strangers in public in daylight is for no reason. It's pretty rare. Yeah. and then necrophilia is even rarer still. And then Ivan's, hanging out down there. Anyway, you were there, like that was another shocking, I
wasn't at Wonder, I was still at school.
No, I know. I'm not saying, where were you?
Actually,
Oh no, I'm about to blackout. Yeah. No. But you covered those.
No, lad, I didn't. Les was really. Kennedy got right into Milat, and I was actually his chief of staff, so I wasn't actually reporting, but I did have a lot to do with it. And I went down to after Ivan was found guilty. Les had a lot of these allegations. He wanted to put some stuff that we were going to put in, and we wanted to talk to Richard Milat. And so they said, Les, you should go down there. So no, he wouldn't go.
Not on his own.
No, so he wouldn't go. He just, I wasn't reporting. And the Cole Allen said, mate, you're going to have to go. It's all right. I go, what? Why do I have to go? And he said, no, you're going down.
He lives in the scrub, in the back of Beyond.
So he said, mate, we've got a private detective going with you who has a gun, right? I went, righto. So this guy, we've got the driver. He's driving us. I've got the guy in the back with the gun. I've got a six-pack and I'm drinking. And I was out down the back of Bargo, and knocked on.
They used to call Milat Bargo Bill.
Yeah.
Like he hunting down in that area.
Well, it was, by the time we get down there, it's fucking dark. And knock on this door, and I said, I wanted to talk to Richard. And I said, well, he's not here, or he is here, but...
Oh, you haven't called in front. You've just you're just knock.
You never call in front. Then people piss off. Anyway,
just cold calling Richard Milat.
Yeah, and the doctor, he said he's in the garage. Yeah, okay, righto. And then this this ex-SAS or whoever he was, the guy with the gun. By this stage, I'm about 4 cans down, and we go there, and there is, I don't know who it was. There's 2 guys there. One was Richard. One was a guy with a hammer. And I said, look, I just wanted to talk about what? I don't know. I just wanted to talk, and this guy's going, get out of the light. This is the guy, the private eye guy, who's supposed to have the gun, say, don't stand in the light. And anyway, I can't really remember. I know I didn't stay there very long, but there was obviously they didn't want to talk. No. So I just got back in the car and I think we might have got another 6-pack for the drive and had to stop at every servo so I could have a piss. But yeah.
Well, I don't think Les and I don't think you and I don't think society, accepts that that's all they did. And I think that there's more to learn there.
I didn't know about King's Cross and some of that. That's really was it in the book or I don't? I haven't read it for a long time.
No.
Yeah.
No, it wasn't. And in actual fact, look, Les and Mark's book's fantastic. Les
but obviously it started
but
a bit late.
There's a bit there where there's a bit of a black hole, and I've had representations from people saying, look, I know someone who hung out with Ivan, and their assertion is that they were basically hitmen as well as psychopaths. They did a bit of cleaning up here and there for people that were problematic, and Ivan was the perfect person. He was pretty sober, pretty straight-laced, not a big drinker, and he had some pretty powerful friends.
That's interesting.
It's an interesting thing, and so I'm digging into that. And so if I get bumped off, my solicitor knows what to do. Now, that leads me into another area, the Wood Royal Commission, because all this mayhem, institutionalised corruption with the police. It was this hard drinking, corrupt culture, and all the rest. And it led to the Wood Royal Commission, that 94-95 period, which saw a massive clean out in the cops. didn't it?
I lost nearly all my contacts. So
You
I didn't
lost-
even know.
They're all-
I had no idea.
hundreds of
Oh, no,
police
seriously.
all retire and move
There were
to.
10 or 12 committed suicide.
Yes, that's right.
There were the Royal Commission was it had to happen, right? It really did. But there was a couple of there was a lot of people I knew, but I didn't know. Again, as I said, Chuck Fowler, who was a contact of mine, who I had no idea how corrupt he was. Trevor Haken, who was the guy who eventually was the main instigator. I used to change his tyres.
He was the whistleblower, wasn't
yeah,
he? He's still
he
in
was.
hiding.
Yeah. Well, yeah, although he's come out now.
Has he?
Yeah, he has spoken. So yeah, it was a turning point, and that was when we got an outside police commissioner. That's how bad it was.
It was Peter Ryan, wasn't it?
Peter Ryan. Now, again, we go to some, the New South Wales Police Force was considered so corrupt. No one trusted anybody. That there was actually a tail put on Peter Ryan, right? It was just, there was an internal affairs unit, but then there was another unit on top of that the internal affairs unit didn't know. There was nothing. No one got promoted. Again, we talk about Les Kennedy and a great journalist, but booze really didn't help him. But I do remember he came up to me and said, "Oh, mate, so-and-so from Chatswood's got a broken toe." And I go, "Oh, I don't care." He said, no. So my mate's now the acting inspector. I went, yeah, piss off, Les. We're in the pub. Kept going. He said, and the guy filled in for him. He's off with, so there's acting. And they weren't promoting anyone because they were too scared to promote anybody after the Royal Commission because they didn't know whether they were corrupt or not. And we had a headline because by the time I got to 3 a.m, I'd figured out that nearly every senior position was now an acting police officer. Nobody, and we had the acting force. But it turned New South Wales policing upside down and, in fact, in a way, turned it around. And there are some cops still around now who are in the force who were honest cops then but said you just couldn't be. You
because
had
if
to
you
turn a blind eye.
weren't you weren't with them, you were
It's real
against them.
Serpico stuff.
Yeah, you were against them, and you were bundled out, bullied out.
My mate to mine telling me, he said they had search warrants, blank search warrants signed by magistrates, like in their drawers, like they just blank had been signed, half a dozen. Oh shit, we're going to go and turn Billy's place over. Oh shit, right?
What for?
Yeah, that was the sort of corruption.
And like New South Wales, what's your view on a lot of people don't know this, but New South Wales Police, I think it rates as the second or third largest state-based sort of sub-national police force in the world. Yeah. It's an enormous institution, isn't it?
It is. It's dwindling. We need more.
It's dwindling. It's hard to get people into it. But does it have too much power? Is it not enough power? Like, what's your view on it now?
I think they've got the good powers now. The serious crime prevention orders, which they use, the consorting laws, which
now they came in basically. They're sort of like our RICO laws, aren't they? Like
consorting laws, a little bit more than they busted the bikies.
Yeah.
How long? You used to think again it was fantastic seeing 60 bikies in their colours, but they not if they turned up at your pub or what?
Yeah,
your
or
wedding
they're selling
reception.
your kids ice or something.
Yeah, but wearing colours is their intimidation, and the consorting laws stopped that as well. So they sound draconian, people consorting with known criminals, but it basically busted up the bikies. You just don't see them anymore.
It's the early 2000s.
Yeah, it all started after the airport brawl.
Yeah,
we got serious.
Yeah, the Hells Angels and the
Commos, and
you had
the Bollard.
Just killing each other in the street.
Yeah. Although we had the bikie man. No, in '84 again, we talk about the '80s and how our police force just really wasn't on top of things. That bikie massacre was the beginning. Up until then, in 1984, bikies were kind of, there was a movie called Stone that just romanticised freewheel. It was like Easy Rider. We thought this is cool. They're just bikies. They punch a few people up and smoke a bit of dope, lock up your daughters. That's about it,
They just won't get a job.
84
haircut.
That was the beginning of the banditos, and they were moving into organised crime.
Yep.
and nothing was done.
And they're an international organisation.
Yeah, well, these guys had been over and had got the, no one remembers, but the Comancheros were, founded in 1969 after Jock Ross watched John Wayne movie.
Yeah, they were an Australian.
Australian.
Yeah.
But the Banditos, and we didn't jump on them then, and it really wasn't until, then again in the late 90s, Middle Eastern organised crime looked at how they could use the bikie badge for intimidation, and that was Sam Ibrahim was at the forefront of that. He changed the face of the bikie world.
A lot of that really moved into the Comancheros, didn't they?
But it was the Comancheros. You had the Nomads. You had some very, very violent clubs. And then you had a lot of young Turks moving in. You had the Lone Wolf, and you had these very, very powerful, violent bikie gangs, and they really took over a lot of Sydney. And it wasn't until 2009 and the airport brawl that all of a sudden New South Wales cops went, and they started Raptor. And that was to go as close as you can up there. Like it literally was, they were not a dirty dozen, but they were told to really get in their face. And they started taking bikies seriously and started really disrupting. That's what Raptor were about, disrupting, harassing, being arseholes.
I heard one cop said to me that they said, this is a criminal environment and we will police every single crime. Oh. It's like the no stopping zone.
Yeah, they did all that.
Modification on the bikes. You're paying everything. Whether they're running a small business, they were just really focused on that group of guys and policing the shit out of them.
And it was Deb Wallace who I wrote a book with. Deb Wallace, who was the head of the gang squad. And she will always say, she just said, I had the smartest, best, toughest guys around me. And they would stop the bikie clubs. They go and smash them up by using liquor laws.
Yeah.
Right? There's almost that old Capone thing. Go from environmental laws and close down clubhouses because they, had a fire escape that wasn't closed. And then the consorting laws really stuffed them. And that's, although they still exist now, I still don't understand how they operate. They still have their they still have their badges, but they do it all in secret. They're kind of like little cubby houses that you don't know
about. The Freemasons or something like that. But the big...
I went to the Freemasons grand dinner the other week.
Did you?
Quite amazing. Anyway, it's another story. I did nothing about them either.
Did they make you wear the apron?
Oh, no, this was the installation of the Grand Master. And unbeknownst to me, some of the friends of mine are Freemasons. And getting back to New South Wales Police Force, the commissioner, you were either a Freemason or a Catholic.
That's it.
That was it.
That's New South Wales politics.
Yeah.
People don't realise half the MPs up there they're in Opus Dei or they're in the Lodge.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
The Lodge.
Oh, yeah.
They're around.
Most Australian prime ministers, I think, had been
10. There's been 10.
Yeah, Freemasons, and I think in the Liberal government, half the cabinet, the blokes were either Freemasons or pretty.
And there are some still New South Wales police who are still cried up there. So I didn't realise that until I said this. And the dinner was quite open, and I was invited as a guest, which was very different.
Yes, well,
anyway,
look, and I'm sure the Freemasons aren't dealing tons of coke, but
no.
that's what changed in the early 2000s, 1990s, 2000s. Drugs really,
heroin
was out,
but let's
and then bags, coke, meth, ice, MDMA, much easier to transport, much more incredible profits, and this incredible market for it. That's what really changed crime in Sydney, wasn't in the 2000s. Coke.
Yeah, it did. It was coke. Coke is still, and it's still the driving force now, which, is funding organised crime. And that's what's leading to all the shootings. And now I would know we'll get into this subject that you and I have debated before about the legalisation. And it's the amount of money being made is staggering. And when I say staggering, there, Hakenaig over in Turkey who fled Sydney. He's from Sydney. He was involved in heroin trade for a bit and then went into cocaine and then fled. He was estimated, and he was mainly running drugs here as $500 million. There are other guys there, like, a guy called Eric Eric the Wolf. He fled Sydney to go over into Turkey. Luckily, he's dead now because he wanted to have me killed after. That's another story. One of the few times I only got scared after the fact when I found out that he had the shits about something I wrote, and he's probably behind about 6 deaths. But he was worth.
Did he put a contract on you?
No, what had happened between you and
That'd make you sit up in bed, wouldn't it?
Well, it wasn't until
get the text message.
Well, it was funny. Keskin is behind probably 6 or 7 organised hits. He paid big money to hitmen to knock off his rivals or somebody that didn't looked at him the wrong way. Like,
really, he was that mad.
He was that mad, Escobar, close. And anyway, I get this phone call saying, "Oh, mate, get down to Central Court. It'll be interesting." Keskin, he's on child porn charges. I went, "Oh, really?" And I think their thinking at the time was, guys, crooks won't roll on drug dealers, killers, but mate, child kiddie porn. Oh. So anyway, I went down there and we had this headline, had the loneliest wolf, right, and a photo of Keskin. And anyway, I didn't cover I just wrote, I wrote it all beforehand for that paper. And then, anyway, I get a phone call that afternoon, Friday afternoon, and it was a very senior cop. He goes, "Oh, mate, we didn't think he'd get bail. Don't worry." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, he's got an ankle bracelet for every state, this guy, He's just...
His bail was $2 million and he's paid cash."
And he said, "Doesn't matter, we've got eyes on him, but if you see anything," I go, "What the?" And I didn't think too much about it until about 18 months later with a new contact and a pretty serious guy. He wasn't a crook, he's just a guy that knows lots of them. And he said he was there and he said, "Mate, there was talk, you'd been red flagged." And I said, "What red flagged? I'm not a communist. What the fuck?" And he said, "No, you know what red flagged means?" And then I spoke to another guy. He said, "Mate, you were lucky." And because I called him a kiddie fiddler. There was a photo of him with his kids in a bath. Or anyway, he wasn't happy. And anyway, he did.
Well, mate, as I said,
6-day binge over in Turkey ended very happily for me.
Yes.
So,
we're probably time for an extradition treaty with Turkey because they all end up like, how come we don't have one? And Lebanon. And
I actually thought at one stage, I think we might have the bones of it. I know it's a federal matter.
Yeah.
But there are guys running their empires and ordering hits.
Yeah.
From overseas. Now, there's two. You talk to senior cops. There are some that go the minute they're out and they want to go overseas, let them go, and they do let them go, right?
Yeah.
Because they go, they're here, they're going to get killed, or someone's going to get the wrong person. And they're just. But other guys go, we can keep an eye on them here because over there they just get bigger and better sometimes.
Yep.
And still run all their lines, but they get there and they feel safe, especially if they've got dual nationality. We've still got a killer over there in Greece, Dalamangos, who killed 2 people. He's over in Greece, and everyone knows. We supposedly have.
That the guy that killed the women down in Melbourne?
No. Dalamangos was a guy. He killed a guy at a restaurant and a bouncer. He ripped a guy's throat out, like a vicious guy, part of the Greek mafia. We have Greek mafia. We have all sorts of mafias. There are still enclaves of very racially, crime gangs, and they still go along race.
We know about the Middle East, but do the Cosa Nostra still operate in like New? Because there was, the Griffith Mafia and Mildura, those areas. There was some huge.
You'll love this story.
There was some huge busts down there, and
in Mildura,
in Mildura, those areas. Are the Black Hand? Was it Black Hand?
Black Hand started, yeah.
Are they still operating in Australia?
The federal police will tell you they are very, very big. New South Wales police will go, huh? Then again, New South Wales and federal police don't see eye to eye on a lot of things. But I didn't. The whole Mildura Griffith connection. I remember I met a guy called Scopoletti was a mate, and we travelled around Europe, came back, went to Mildura. We'd been backpacking, didn't have much money, went back to his home. He went to draw some money out, and he got like $400, which that was basically it, and came back with his balance, and it was 43,700. He goes, "No, we're the Scopolitis that grow oranges." He said the others, they grow them in between. But it was huge, I mean, the marijuana market is still very, very big.
It is big.
But it's now,
I remember going to Mildura and I was visiting some farmers down there, and I was down there and pro cannabis, all the rest. I got there and they said they toured me around the watermelon farm. I won't say the family's name, and they said, "Nan, we grow grapes, we grow watermelons, and now do you want to see the marijuana?" Because that's where. And they said, "We've got all the Indian guys growing it between underneath the grapevines."
Well, and that's a lot of,
and that was a huge market in the 70s, and now it's gone indoors and
hydroponic,
hydroponic Vietnamese crime gangs.
Huge.
They were like, you talk about ethnic groups. They are still a big.
Well, they're behind this kidnapping and murder of the woman and the assault of an 8-year-old kid. It's the Vietnamese. There is there is a female Vietnamese crime boss believed to be responsible for up to maybe 6 people being killed. Vietnamese in Sydney, they are ruthless.
And there's big money. Like a lot of that's the precursors for meth and ice and MDMA coming in out of Myanmar and Vietnam.
Yeah,
Laos.
How do we stop it?
Yeah,
I mean, I know that we get to the legalisation argument, and when it comes to the cocaine, well, who's going to go over there and are you going to go and broker the deal with the Escobar, whoever it is at the moment? Because they're the only ones doing it.
No.
It's not like you can manufacture cocaine, right? It is South America and Mexico, right? So, and we're going to send our trade minister over there to do the deal. You're going to have to deal with crooks. So whatever we're doing, we're going to be funding people getting killed. It's a tough one, and
we're an importing, exporting nation. The amount of
the coke is affected by the price of the dollar, fluctuation in the dollar.
Yeah, it's an international commodity.
It's a commodity,
exactly.
So if you're doing 2 ton, that's going to affect.
Really, the only way to go after it is to go after the money, the movement of the money. These RICO laws and these
our guys are pretty good now with the money laundering, and they do chase the money. But now crypto, they're going, God, how do we do that?
How do we do that?
And it's just off there in space.
Yeah.
So they've got their work cut out, and as I said, it fuels. It doesn't matter. We kind of decriminalise it in a lot of ways. We have. You're caught with a bag of coke, you're not going to get. Most of the time, you're going to get let off.
Yeah, well, I have been.
Yeah. I know quite a few that have too.
That was a joke.
No, was it? No one. I would have thought someone would have rung up pretty quickly if you got done. Hey, Mom, guess what? We got him.
I know.
There are some police officers that love you, some that don't. Actually, I can't think of anyone that loves you. I made that one up.
No. But let's get to the nitty gritty, which is decriminalisation. Why not take the money out of it? Because we've had a debate about this before. Like, they're not doing this for fun. They're not doing this as a community service. Why don't we, at least we start with cannabis? Because I know with the Vietnamese, and that's a startup business for them. They can get, an old industrial estate, some tunnels in a market garden, or a hydroponic set up in a house, and they can turn that into hundreds of thousands of dollars pretty quick. Turn that into millions of dollars.
Seed money, it's called.
It's seed money. And then the other thing, and so they use that money for handguns and, human trafficking.
And do you think once it's legalised, they're going to stop? They're going to undercut, and that's what's been happening in a lot of the American states.
So you reckon that's the issue?
Big problem. That is, and the other thing, as I said, I hate being portrayed as a straight 180 because I think a bit of dope here and there. It's okay, but legalisation, I get worried about the effects it has on young brains, particularly, right? Now, I remember there's a former drug squad boss, Nick Bingham, who we used to chat quite a lot, and I think he got in a bit of trouble because he doesn't mind. He said, legalise if we could, but as long as you couldn't smoke it till you were 25, because the brain, it fucks up so many people's brains. Now, I don't know how we address that.
Well, no, the science is in on that, and it's certainly very, very bad for you. And if you know, at home, if you're routinely smoking cannabis,
Especially at a young age,
and
when
if
your
you're
brain's developing.
under 17, you know, it can be detrimental to you.
And
You
it
can
leads to schizophrenia. And that's my issue. Again, legalising it sends a big message, and I don't know the answers, you know. And it's the same with the same argument that we had with pill testing. And I'm actually honestly asking, because I know I've been anti it because for a whole lot of reasons. But I have tried to look up a lot of research because it is introduced and been a lot of places in Europe. But I can't find any really solid data that says it has saved. I mean, I'm sure someone out there will send it to you.
I can get you some on in Canberra and the
but it hasn't saved life. We don't know.
It has, because I'll tell you how it saved.
About 8 people have fucking gone and got it tested because they take your pill.
No, they don't take your pill. They take part of it and they test.
No, they can't give it back to you because that's dealing drugs. You sure that's what goes on now?
Well, we're not handing the whole lot over. So you say, here's a bit of what I've got. Right. There you go. So and they test it. 30%, at least 30% of people say, that is not what I bought. Yeah. There's more in that than I thought, and throw it away. So there's 30% of people who are going and using a drug checking service.
There were 20,000 people at one of those festivals, and I think 140 people. I mean, the percentage.
Yes, but I think it has to be normalised where people go, look, if I go into the drug checking tent and the cops are waiting on the others,
they're not doing that, and I think they're very.
They're not.
A lot of cops are odd. Yeah, a lot of cops, they toe the government line, and they do, and their senior cops are very, very conservative because they see that no matter what you do, that pill trade, the fact that you say, pill testing, they reckon the drug dealers just go, ka-ching, thank you very, very much. That's going to make our job so much easier. And they see the side effects, which is the broken bones and dead bodies. Not to me, I still wonder whether it could be better used than pill testing to send a message. Anyway, I could waver. I know I've been staunch. I got interviewed by some guy in Rolling Stone, and I'll come out like a fucking 70-year-old anti-fucking drug that, I'll sound like an evangelist from the 30s prohibition. I'm not. No. I'm willing to see if I see
base it on the evidence. And like the point you made about cannabis is a legitimate one, and they'll
just undercut.
They will undercut, but to the point where that
firebomb your chemist.
Well,
they will. They'll look at the tobacco.
Well, in the States that hasn't happened, but what's happened is you have had people move out of the legal market back into the illegal market, basically because it's so heavily regulated, because there's taxes and compliance and all the rest of it. So the answer to that for a lot of people is they say, look, people should just be able to grow their own. So grow a few plants, adults, share it amongst their friends. They haven't seen an increase in youth use of cannabis in places where they've legalised. A lot of it because a lot of the mystique's gone out of it. Cannabis is seen as a drug that oldies have for back pain, and it's a bit of a boomer drug. But
it also, there's a little downside that it potentially dementia, which I'm going to get anyway. I have bits of it at time. But there are, we have got a lot of people now that, let's face it, very, very easy to get legal cannabis now. And I was just reading, I think, and I was just thinking, I've got problems, bad back or whatever. But they also do say there's older people using it are exposing themselves to perhaps to higher risk of dementia.
Well, I'm not sure about that.
I don't know. I think
there are some neurological disorders, certainly Parkinson, that's very, very good for MS and other things. But there's a gigantic laboratory operating right now. We're getting all the information, and that's the United States and Canada, where they're managing to regulate it relatively successfully. No one's, even on the conservative side of politics, no
Really?
one's saying no one's saying repeal. I think there's a couple of
There
Florida.
are a few people.
There are a few Florida politicians that are
So
pushing back.
I haven't researched enough. I do know I spoke to a retiring federal police agent, Neil Gagan, who'd been, and he went over to Portland, a whole lot of places, and he said these were cities that he used to love, and he said they've been turned upside down with the legalisation and dropping it. Now, I said I haven't seen it personally, and I haven't read enough, but just the little snippets I get, I haven't heard what's going down in Canberra, how it's going there.
Going very well. The cops
Right.
have actually come out and said,
Have they?
Yeah, they've flipped on it.
Right.
They've actually flipped. And in Portland, one of the interesting things that we argue, because we're the legalised cannabis party, is do cannabis first. So, like make sure that you get this right before you look at any of the other drugs, because what they did in the States is they took the cops out of the policing because they legalised cannabis, like it's pretty much like as legal as onions, and decriminalised a lot of these other drugs when they've got this fentanyl epidemic, and that took the police out of basically that role of getting people who are in trouble with drugs and feeding them into the not only just the criminal justice system, but also into help, for addiction and housing and all the other things. So the cops are going, well, that's not our job anymore. Yeah. We're not policing that anymore. So they really rushed in, and so I think it was actually.
And in Portugal, has that gone back?
No, Portugal's very, very.
I thought it would start.
No, it's pretty successful in Portugal. Most European countries now are adopting those models. Switzerland has. Germany's just legalised cannabis.
Well, maybe I'll just be an old fuddy-duddy.
You might be an old fuddy-duddy, mate. But look, we're a product of our youth and
plenty.
but
there's a lot of people. Like I've got a lot of people I know who.
I'm sure, mate. There was been a herbal cheroot handed
Mate,
around.
we used
down
to have
at the
our
Daily
own dealer. Like when we go back to the wild old days of News Limited and other newspapers, we had our own dealer. We had our own bookie.
It was all a tax write-off.
We didn't even have to leave the office.
I bet, mate. It was wild days. But look, it's a discussion we'll continue to have.
And I've got to do a lot more reading so I can either argue or put up the white flag.
Well, I hope you put up the white flag, mate, because it's coming. Like
it might be.
There's never get between a politician and a bucket of money, they say, and there's a lot of tax revenue in it. And we think that.
Oh well, that's great. Look what happened with poker machines.
Don't
start me on that.
Well,
I love them, though, but anyway.
Yeah, but we don't want to see we don't want to see them forced on people, and we don't want to see it as becoming like a cash cow. Yeah. Certainly, we want to see it as a regulated. We haven't done a great job with some of these things, like tobacco and alcohol. Big problems.
And
with
they're the arguments a little bit. They really are. That's coming from a person who's been drinking. Maybe once or had a beer or two, you could probably gather by some of my stories. And they're the ones that I could tell.
I know.
So, there are a lot of things.
But it's an important discussion that we're now having. And, look, I really appreciate it.
Yep.
Mark, look, you're an amazing guy. Balls of steel, got to say, mate, doing the work you do. You've incredible public service, telling these hard stories, really, really hard stories at the edges of society and into some pretty dark and dangerous places. And so it's been a real privilege to talk to you, to have that opportunity. And I very much appreciate you coming into the weeds to share some.
Great set, a great set.
It's a great set, mate.
I didn't realise it was going to be video. I would have.
Would have done your hair. Would have done your hair. Me too.
I would have had a haircut.
No, mate.
Yeah. Okay.
But this is an audience that laps this stuff up. I really appreciate it.
Probably not Telegraph readers, though.
Oh yeah. No. Like we're actually it's a little young man, a lot of 20 to 30-year-olds who aren't reading like mainstream media, are going to YouTube and places like that for their information, and hence why it's so important to talk to you, who've had so much experience in crime and what's really going on in the streets of Sydney. So I really appreciate it. We'll keep talking about weed, Milat, and all the rest. And
I'm interested about the 70s stuff.
Yeah. When I get that information, mate, I'll give you the drop for sure.
Okay.
Thanks a lot, Mark. Thanks for coming into the weeds.
Okay. Bye.
Thanks, mate.
Later.